Okay, welcome. I'm Ann Russo, and I'm a professor in Women's and Gender Studies at DePaul University. And we're very excited today to have Dr. Sanjukta Mukherjee talk to my class. It's WGS 391, Methods in Scholarship in Women's and Gender Studies. And so we're very excited to have Dr. Mukherjee with us today to talk about her research. So I'm going to do an introduction to her. She is a faculty member and graduate director in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies here at DePaul University. She's also an affiliated faculty in the Department of Geography and International Studies and the Global Asian Studies program, as well as the Sustainable Urban Development program. Her research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of transnational feminisms, urban geographies, and critical development studies. She's particularly interested in the relationship between culture and the economy, how neoliberal globalization reconfigures work, workplaces, and livelihoods in cities of the global South. She's also interested in questions of interdisciplinarity, feminist methodologies, and pedagogies, which are central to our interests in this class. Her co-authored book, titled Low Wage in High Tech, an ethnography of service workers in global India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. It explores the life stories and work experiences of drivers, security guards, and housekeepers who offer key services to the multinational technology industries in India, but often remain invisible in the celebratory narratives of globalization. So Dr. Mukherjee, we are so happy to have you with us today. And if we could all give a warm welcome to Dr. Mukherjee. And I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you everyone in 391. It's my pleasure to hang out with you all and, share a little bit about my research and how I got to my research. This is a conversation. So this is my plan. Tell me how this sounds. And if you all have other suggestions, please feel free to let me know. So what I was thinking I would do is offer you a few sort of like framings and contexts in terms of how I came to the research I do. What are the theoretical framings? What are some methodological concerns? The things that I researched, how I did it, and then what are some challenges that I encountered during the process of research? Because that is always, no matter how much you plan, how many methods classes you're in, there are always things that you encounter when you're in the field or while you're in the process of doing that research. And as feminist scholars, I think about the fact that we always need to be kind of responsive and reflexive in incorporating those challenges into how we think about those projects, how we theorize, right? So I think of theory as praxis, like practice and theory go hand in hand. And the process of research in a feminist manner should and does change how we think about theory itself. So that whole process of theory building by itself is that kind of relational process, right? So what I thought I'd do is give you a couple of things to look at. I have a PowerPoint slide just because it's just visual, helps with some visuals. And then most of the time I thought what we would do after is do Q&A and have you all ask me questions and be in conversation with you about things that you're interested in, that you have questions about. Does that sound good? All right. Thank you. All right. Now, let me see if I can share screen. Okay. And then, okay. Let's see if that works. Okay. Can you all see the slides? Okay. All right. So, so here are some questions that I know we all think about as we are in a feminist classroom thinking about research. What is actually research? How do feminists think about research? What does that mean? Is there a specific feminist method that is advisable for people to follow? How is theory connected to method and methodology? How do you arrive at your research question and the appropriate method to answer that question? And most importantly, I think for feminist scholars, how do we remain accountable, ethical, and center practices of reflexivity, positionality, and this kind of feminist ethic of care while we engage in any kind of research, no matter what that kind of research is. So I'm not saying that my presentation is going to answer all of these, but I'm just putting these out as things that I know we all think about, right? And there may be other things you think about. I'd love to hear more what your questions are. But these are some things I know we think about. And as a feminist scholar, these are things that doesn't always get resolved, but we engage with them during the process of the research itself. So one thing I wanted to share at the beginning was how Sandra Harding talks about the connections between epistemology or feminist theory, methodology, and method. She says a research method is a technique, so it's like a tool, right, for gathering evidence, while methodology is a theory and analysis of how research is done or should proceed, often influenced by particular disciplines. And an epistemology is a theory of knowledge, right? So I really want to think about them together, and that's what I'm trying to do is give you an example from my research and how I do this connection between, epistemology or knowledge or feminist politics, link it to methodology and my methods, right? I think it's important to think about them as connected. So, and this is a particular kind of example from my project. So, for me, feminist politics and epistemology informs the kinds of questions we ask as researchers. Even if you do research on the same issue or topic, what kind of feminist politics you ascribe to might make that project different based on where you're coming from. What is at stake for you? So for me, I am always currently on my current research project has been influenced heavily by transnational feminisms, particularly critique of neoliberal capitalism, imperialism, heteropatriarchy, and a commitment to cross-border collaborative practice in knowledge production. So I'm laying out some of the key frameworks that transnational feminism offers that influences my research. Secondly, I think it's for my projects, I always think it is so important to understand how systems of oppression work. Like how do they work? How do these big systems of oppression like capitalism are linked to institutions, right? And how these institutions are actually not just local or domestic, but they actually operate in transnational scales across many borders. Right, and these interactions between these transnational institutions, systems, as well as local and domestic politics and institutions influence working conditions, influence labor policy, and that impact people's everyday lived material bodily experiences. So, oftentimes scholarship can sound like there's this kind of disjuncture between people who look at broad systems and people who look at lived experiences of folks on the ground. I really think that transnational feminism offers a way to look at both of them together and actually look at how systems impact these systems of oppressions and that work through these institutions impact things on the ground, like labor policy, working conditions, and those have real material bodily impact for people's lives. And secondly, transnational feminism also offers us a way to think about systems and institutions in complex ways so that we don't think they operate the same way everywhere, right? The ways in which they operate within frameworks of national governments differ based on what is the kind of state or nation it is. So the way neoliberalism works in a context of settler colonialism might be different in the way neoliberalism works in a post-colonial country in the global South that came out of colonial rule, right? So the state structures are different. Even if systems are kind of universal, they operate differently on the ground. And I think or similarly, there are both similarities and differences to consider. And transnational feminism offers us opportunity to interrogate those nuances. And finally, I think it is really important for transnational feminisms to question all kinds of binaries and think about how many of the things that we take for granted are socially constructed and politically nuanced, right? They're informed by politics. So this connection between culture and economy that I'm really interested in, they are seen as different terrains, but they're often mutually constitutive. They feed off of each other. The idea between local and global, tradition and modernity, formal and informal, developed and underdeveloped, first world and third world, theory and practice, academic and activist, right? These are all constructed as these kind of binary oppositional spaces, positions, or themes. And I find transnational feminism offers me to interrogate those, problematize those, and look at the connections between those. So because I'm interested in these kinds of questions informed by transnational feminism, the kinds of research questions I ask are these. So I'll explain them. So the kinds of things I'm interested in is, for example, how has neoliberal globalization transformed gendered relations of work and workplaces in Indian cities? Here, the context of specifically post-colonial states like India, and particularly cities, you know, like the differences between sort of urban, the particularities of urban development, and how these systems, broader systems, have to negotiate, or they have an influence on particular localities, particular places. That's why that question comes from, you know, the stuff that I was talking about before. How are these transformations also classed, racialized, sexualized, and or based on other caste and region-based inequalities? These kinds of you know, the ways in which capitalism works and influences different parts of the world, again, needs to be seen in sort of like intersectional ways, but the things that we consider when we think about these systems at work might be unique to specific places. So for example, in the Indian case, caste emerges, regional inequalities become a really important thing. So that kind of thing makes us consider the fact that even these systems that are universal has to negotiate local, regional dynamics. What are the connections or contradictions between state discourses of development, organizational practices of information technology firms, and everyday lives of workers? So again, looking at multiple players and different kinds of people positioned differently, that helps understand how the system works, which is something that I'm interested in. How do working people, especially women identified folks, navigate, challenge, and transform their lives in service sectors like the IT industry? So thinking about the relationship between culture and economy, thinking about the relationship between systems, institutions, and individuals, I think that I'm interested in understanding how people, you know, like resist, maybe even in their everyday kind of ways, in small ways, how they think about navigating the challenges that neoliberalism brings to them, and how they make sense of it in their own lives. And another thing to consider is that these systems are often contradictory and can offer different kinds of opportunities to different kinds of people, right? So not to assume that it impacts everybody the same way. Again, something that transnational feminism really highlights, that we also need to think about the sort of different kind of power asymmetries between different kinds of people, not to assume, for example, that neoliberalism always impacts women in the global South in negative ways, right? Because if there are middle class women in the IT firms, they are very differently impacted than people who are more like working class, or they're doing more menial jobs, right? So it is really, so my questions again come from this sort of transnational feminist concern around homogenizing this sort of the figure of the oppressed third world woman, right? So therefore, I'm interested in looking at the nuances between this group of people who work in the IT sector. And again, another question that I was interested in, and I'm still interested in, is that does work in globalized spaces like multinational technology industries challenge local gender, class, and caste regimes in India? Is economics or working in the economy the only way to gain empowerment? And more importantly, that does engaging in a globalized economy, right? One of the things that neoliberalism does is says that the global market, or participating in the global market, is going to be beneficial for everyone. That is their logic. So what I wanted to interrogate is that really true? Does that work on the ground, right? And across different kinds of women, not just working class women. So those research questions then stem from transnational feminism, and they influence the kind of thing that I also think about in terms of designing my research project. So there's the methodological guidelines also come from my feminist politics, my transnational feminist leanings. And one of the things within that is that I'm interested, as I was saying, both in culture and economy. So I kind of draw from some materialist feminists, like Marxist feminists, who actually are really interested in questions of labor and social reproduction, but also acknowledge the fact that the world is socially constructed. So how these people make meanings of things, how they experience it might be different, and maybe beyond sort of just an analysis of class and capitalism. You have to think about other kinds of things that interact with capitalism, right? Like casteism in the case of India, a certain kind of patriarchal heteronormativity that is also part of many societies. So really thinking about the fact that in order to understand or do this research project, there are multiple ways to do it, but because I'm interested in that sort of question of labor and economy, I'm interested in how people, but I'm also interested in how people make meanings of these real sort of issues, right? So then taking both materialist feminisms and social constructivisms together. And there are some scholars who also call this, there's a term called critical realism. There are some scholars who use this term to think about the fact that, yes, the world is socially, there are some realities in the world. There's, like these systems operate on the ground, we feel it on our bodies. There are some real material impacts of these systems. So there's this kind of real world, but we can only understand so much of it. That's why they use the word critical realism. So critical realism kind of appreciates both the sort of structures as well as the social constructiveness of the world, right? So both systems as well as the way in which people make meanings of these systems and the way in which they understand these systems. So because of this, and these are probably some things you're already aware of and you're already thinking about. So because of these feminist values or leanings, some things that I have thought about while designing my project is situatedness and partiality of knowledge. That, knowledge is always, like I was saying, you can only understand so much of things. There are some things you'll not understand or you never understand, right? So this knowledge is always partial, it's situated. And it is important to also understand all these different kinds of power asymmetries, depending on not just between the researcher and the research, but also where you do the research, right? So as a geographer, I'm always aware of sort of like the dynamics of the place in which the research is conducted. some scholars have called this microgeographies of interview sites and power, how they work in these spaces. Therefore, I'm interested also in sort of doing research that is multi-sited and multi-scalar, because it allows me to do that connection between local and the global, right? Between the big system and how it works through institutions, between the connections between how systems operate through the state, through institutions, through workplaces, and through individual material bodies, right? And if you understand these systems, you also then understand where are the spaces for intervention, where are the spaces for resistance within this system. So there are multiple ways of thinking about this, but that's sort of my mindset when I was doing this particular project that you all read about. Questions of ethics, care, and accountability, certain things that feminists have always been thinking about. And I can talk more about that maybe during Q&A, but really thinking about not just sort of care and ethics for the people you are participating with, but also the places where there are maybe other people involved. There may be people who are bystanders, people who have enabled your project in some way or the other. So those kinds of questions. Confidentiality of research participants, questions of language and translation. This is so important, no matter what research you do. And one of the things that I've learned is sometimes there are so many nuances in language, in body language, in verbal language. So when you're recording somebody, when you're interviewing somebody, sometimes I feel like sometimes a lot can be said without like actually words. So being sensitive and aware of that, right? And sometimes when things are not brought up, or maybe you're not finding the things you're expecting, so there are silences. I think those silences are as important to understand as what is being said, right? So these are some things that that also influence how you write up your research. What do you do with it after you've done the research, right? Questions of how you present your voice and findings, how you present other people who have participated in it, whose stories are told, how they are told. And irrespective of what kind of research is done, you as a researcher is always the one who's interpreting, who's analyzing, who's writing about it. So there's a certain degree of sort of like you are very much part of the project you're doing, right? So there's many tricky things to consider. All right, moving on, here are some methods that they've given the kinds of questions I'm interested in. These are the kinds of questions, these are the methods or tools that I've used, right? So, and I also wanted to say that the article you all read on studying up, there's a very specific challenge, or there's a particular kind of, concern with sort of this kind of research that studies up to learn about powerful institutions or powerful industries or powerful elites, where when you do that kind of work, the traditional sort of power hierarchies between the researcher and research get a little bit reversed, right? So I didn't feel like I was I was the one holding a lot of power during the process of research, because I was interviewing very powerful people who are the movers and shakers of the capitalist system, right? In India, a lot of people, and also those positions mostly held by upper class, elite women and men. So I can talk more about that, but I think there are particular challenges of studying up. And it is also important to study up, and I've been interested in it because, again, it allows me to see how these systems operate. How do companies and organizations come up with the policies they do? How that impacts people whose livelihoods depends on working in these firms, right? So really interrogating those sort of policies. So I did interviews with differently positioned participants, different kinds of peoples within institutions, but I also, of course, interviewed the people who work in the industry, people who work as software programmers, but also in my newer project, people who work in support positions, like drivers, the security guards, and and the housekeepers, right? I also did some focus groups. Focus groups are the ones I did were mostly at that time focusing on people who work as software programmers. In the more recent project that led to the book, that in that research we did focus groups with more of the drivers, the security guards, and the housekeepers. So different kinds of focus groups for different aspects of the project. We also did some participant observations, which means like we kind of hung around where we could in these companies. It was not easy to hang around because there's a lot of security, and we were asking lots of nosy questions about their practices. So we weren't always welcomed or entertained. I have some funny stories about how I was chased once by a security guard who was trying to take photos of something I shouldn't have, but anyway. The other kind of methods that I have used is, archival research, a little bit of policy analysis or discourse analysis, some institutional ethnography. What I mean by institutional ethnography is really looking at specific institutions, right? So for example, like the institutions we looked at, particularly was the human resource departments within these corporate firms, right? So really looking at that institution and the different players in that institution, both the management and the staff and the professionals who work there, right? So these are some kind of methods that I used. So what are some challenges that I faced while I was studying up? So as I was starting to talk about this, that one of the things that is really challenging when you study up is gaining trust, respect, and access, because a lot of the elite bureaucrats or even company executives are very suspicious of people who are trying to ask questions about their labor policy or their methods or their conditions of work. Many of these people employ contract labor in their firms, particularly for the low-income workers, and they don't want to disclose that information. So I actually encountered many challenges in terms of getting access or even talking to people, because again, these institutions are set up to create these kinds of barriers so that people don't understand how oppression occurs through their policies, right? So I think there are particular challenges then that you're faced with as a researcher. And of course, all kinds of other, and some of this was in the article that you all read, that a lot of this also, of course, has to do with who you are as a person, right? Like your institutional affiliation might gain you some kinds of privileges, but on the other hand, if you're a woman, if you're young, if you are seen as an outsider, those kinds of things can put particular kinds of challenges in addition to this. So I'm happy to talk more about that. The other kind of challenge I wanted to say is about anytime you do research on working people or within a workplace, there's always this kind of thing that that some of the kinds of questions you're asking, or like your well-intentioned interest in learning about the working conditions of people, might also expose people who speak to you to some kind of vulnerabilities, because they might be seen as, they're like telling on their bosses, right? So many people who you speak to or interview might feel uncomfortable speaking to you because they are scared of being fired, right? So I think one really has to think about this. While I wanted to do this research because I was interested in the kinds of experiences and challenges working people were facing, but then I also had to think really seriously about how would I do that. These are the things, like I often faced people who thought I was part of the management. Like I was asking these questions to sort of get a sense of what I think of individual workers. So you have to really navigate that there are these kinds of power dynamics between different kinds of working people within the system, between the management, between the workers and the researchers. So establishing relationships become really hard, unlike many other kinds of research that you do, right? So this is because of the kind of projects that you design. The other thing we faced in, this is with the new book, which kind of is an extension of my previous work, where we researched the low-income workers. Now in that project, because this industry is so precarious, there are high attrition rates, oftentimes when we went back to look for the same workers we spoke to, it was hard to find them, right? And a lot of these workers were migrant folks. They were migrant men and women coming from the rural areas to the urban areas. When, for example, I mean, you know, when something happens, or there's a festival, or you know, they go back to their villages, and you know, it was hard to find and re-interview the same people that you spoke to before. So because of that, because of the nature of the industry, it was a little bit hard to develop long-standing relationships. I did interview some people more than once, but it was not something that was very common. It was hard to do that. And the other very challenging thing, which is what I wrote about in the article, is, you know, how as a feminist scholar, you might have very strong opinions about certain things. You enter this research project thinking that, you know, you're being impartial, you're wanting to hear what the people on the ground are saying, but sometimes your own politics or your own sort of criticism of a particular thing might, and you're of course on different location, your different positionality, your different experiences, sometimes might pose specific kinds of challenges in how you interact with participants, how you may disagree with something somebody is saying. How do you reconcile that during the process of the interview, as well as when you're writing it up, right? So there are differences in positions, differences in politics. You have a certain kind of your own values, and that might be challenged when you're on the ground, right? So those are other challenges that I particularly faced. And very quickly, couple of things that I wanted to share with you is what I did to address some of these challenges. And one of the most important things to say is, again, that sometimes you may not resolve everything. But one of the most important things that I learned from researching on the ground, speaking to people who really are part of these industries and institutions, is that certain things that you as a research scholar goes with in mind, you have to be open to that being challenged. And in the process, as a feminist scholar, revisit the ways you started to think about them. So one of the frameworks are, so basically you recontextualize theory and analysis based on your findings and based on the research. I'll give you a quick example about this. So, you know, when we were doing research on, and this is the more collaborative research I did on the book, when we were looking at the drivers, the security guards and housekeepers, and we were interviewing them, one of the things that some of the drivers brought up was that there are these GPS systems and cameras in their cars that they have to keep, right? Even in the workplaces, in the offices of these IT companies, there is security cameras everywhere, right? Now, as a feminist scholar who's critical about questions of surveillance and policing, I went with that idea that is wrong, that is problematic. Why should, I may have asked leading questions like, what do you agree with this or disagree with this? And then what I learned during the process from the folks on the ground, from the research participants, is that there are some times that they think cameras and surveillance are good for them. And I'll give you an example why. So the drivers who are seen as kind of threats, because women are kind of the drivers basically travel back and forth to take the working women from their homes to these IT workplaces or call centers that work overnight. And there has been cases of sexual abuse and violence. And in those cases, in some of those cases, drivers have been seen as the culprits, right? But there's also a parallel discourse that is problematic about migrant men as potential sexual offenders, right? People who are lower class, lower caste are kind of criminalized as potential rapists. So the drivers told us that we like that there are cameras, because the cameras show that we haven't done anything. It was the customers or the people riding with us who wanted to stop in between. And they're not allowed to stop between their pickup and a drop-off place, but sometimes people will go elsewhere or people want stops. The other cases where housekeepers or janitors were sometimes blamed for missing things, missing items in their workplaces. And these are the instances when they tell us that, it's we like that there are cameras. It shows that we didn't do it. So now, this is a dilemma, right? I still think that the cameras and surveillance is problematic, but I also have to take what is being said by my participants seriously, and cannot just like not include it or not engage with it. We really have to interrogate, and it helps me think about questions of surveillance in more nuanced ways, right? And it reframed the ways we ask the questions to other participants after that. So we really revisit our research methods and follow-up interviews. The other thing is, as I was saying, you just can't sort of not address this when you're writing this up, right? Transparency in analysis and writing, exploring the contradictions, the differences, the silences, the frustrations, even failures, what you're unable to do, right? And thinking about these in more sort of nuanced ways and addressing them as you are trying to analyze it and writing about it. Sometimes there will be questions that are unanswered and unresolvable, but maybe those things can open up new directions for future research. Things that unanswered questions can be pursued by somebody else or by yourself in a different project, right? The other thing that I think is a useful strategy often is to collaborate with local and community-based folks who are people who are already advocating for these groups of workers in those cities that I did research in, labor unions, organizations. So I did a lot of that. Some of the interviews were with people who have already been engaged in these questions and are working on it. And the last thing I wanted to say, that this kind of feminist research, or any kind of feminist research that, of course, holds all these contradictions and looks at the nuances between projects, between different kinds of people in the projects, all this take time, right? Like these kinds of things are very time consuming, oftentimes. There needs to be space for reflection, so that you can think about them, you can reincorporate them in your theory and in your methodologies. So there's a group of feminist scholars, feminist geographers actually, who talk about that fact that oftentimes institutional places and the ways in which the academy's design doesn't allow us to have this time, doesn't allow us space. We are often like, in crunch time, we're trying to do research very quickly. And that doesn't allow the space for thoughtful, mindful, complex understandings of the process of research. So there's a group of feminist scholars who advocate for slow scholarship. I've been reading them up a lot, so I just wanted to mention, I can share the reference. Basically, they say that the ways in which we think about research and this kind of really quick publish and perish mentality in the academy is problematic. And it is, again, linked to broader neoliberal frameworks. So they wrote this article in 2015 advocating for slow scholarship. And that has been one of the ways in which I've been thinking about sort of addressing some of these challenges, right? I think that's it from my end. I am happy to answer questions and hang out with you all and see where the conversation leads. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sanjukta. So I'm going to turn it over to the class, and if you all want to ask some questions.
As you all think about questions, what I thought I might do, let me see if I can do this, is if it will be helpful, I can pass on the slides as a file. I can copy and send it on to chat so that people can share it or look at it again if you like. Let me see how to do that. That's weird. Share. I can't find the tab to do that.
So I guess I'll ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just interested in what led you to geography? Like, what led you to this set of questions? You know, like what, you know, I'm sure like you weren't born thinking about these questions. So what, you know, kind of what led you to this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I think that geography, you know, we often, I mean, thinking about, I've always been, okay, I'll backtrack a little and say, I've always been interested in gender and labor issues. And that has to do with the strong women in my family. I've always seen, you know, my role models, my mom, my grandma, my aunts, like all these amazing women who have always pushed the boundaries of what women can do and can't do. And so I've always seen them. So, you know, my mom, many years ago, my mom did a project as part of her PhD on how working versus non-working mothers grapple with their children and how their children cope might have to do with some of these differences in gender and class. And so, you know, I think that, I mean, I was really young then, not that I understood everything, but I really thought those were cool questions to ask. And I think subconsciously I've always been interested in this set of idea that you know, why are there restrictions on who can do what, and why are certain kinds of labor seen to be more valuable than others? So as I was thinking about these issues, and parallelly I was also studying all kinds of course, subjects in school, but geography always, I think, called to me because of the way in which it studies, particularly the what is it called, subdiscipline within geography. There's a whole field called feminist geography, but even before feminist geography, I was introduced to economic and social geography. And within economic and social geography, I realized that they're not just studying economics. I mean, I had to read some boring stuff about, you know, which minerals come from which part of the country, that kind of stuff. But then you really start to see, when you're exposed to more sort of the social side of it, you see them grapple with the same kinds of questions: the relationship between space and economy, the relationship between space and power. So then I was introduced to feminist geography, and I learned that feminist geographers really study about power hierarchies and power differences. And I was able to sort of explore the questions that I already had through this field. So I don't know, I think that's kind of the story, what drew me to geography. But of course it has, like you're saying, like like you asked, it precedes my sort of even understanding of these issues more academically. Some of this had to do with, you know, how I was raised, what I saw when I was young, and that kind of stuff.
Thank you. Okay, do you all want to ask the questions?
Is Aviv asking a question? I see in.
Yeah, sorry, it didn't post. I'm trying to post the whole thing now. Sorry about that.
No worries. I am trying to send you all. Oops. Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aviv. That's a really thoughtful question. So one of the things I think to think about is that some of these issues and how people make sense of what we think of research can also be context specific, and as in how can I say this? So when during the process of research, actually, while as feminists we often think about the historically oppressive ways in which research has been done, the ways in which academics often often depend on folks outside the academy to do the project, but that is not valued or is not recognized in the research process itself or in the writing. So that's definitely real. But one of the other things I think about in the process of doing some of these research is sometimes it's really amazing how people who you are speaking with, they want to tell their stories. They've never been like some of the people we spoke to that contributed to the book, to researching about the book, or even during my older research, is that even if they work in this industry that is so visible and powerful and so valuable in the Indian economy, individual people have all kinds of other stories to share, and they don't always find that voice within their workplaces, maybe even within their homes. Then the responsibility is huge where they're sharing that story with you. And how do you say that? How do you incorporate that story? How do you bring that to people that they want that to be shared with? But I think that's what I'm saying, that I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, or in terms of like, when you say, how do you balance the need, for our own experiences and privileges, and not forcing ourselves to and others to uncover themselves. Yes, it's really important though to sort of think about nuances here, that I don't think, like, there are many instances where people were hesitant or wasn't interested. So you need to like really like, frame your questions in a way, or design your project in a way that that the people who you are working with doesn't feel pressured to speak to you. So many of the and this is some of the things that also are part of some of the consent process, although there are all kinds of other challenges with the IRB and the consent process. But at the same time, there are procedures that have been put in place because this has been a concern historically. I don't know if that answers your question, Aviv, a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Actually, Sanjukta, I think related to that is like, who do you see as your audience? Like, how do like, what are your audiences and maybe even goals?
Yeah, and that's a tricky question, and of course there are limitations in terms of like the scope of the research, like who are you speaking to? So for example, in both the article that you all read and then also the book project we did, I think mainly my investment was in raising awareness about this very celebrated sector amongst people who don't know much about it, but are always advocating that this is the best sector for future development in India. In that sense, I think my audience was mostly people who are policymakers, people who work in labor unions and organizations, people who are even working as software professionals in these companies. Of course, we wrote in English, so there are limitations in the sense that the workers whose stories we translated and shared are not able to read that, right? So we are not able to reach that group, and talked about how we might maybe translate some of these findings into regional languages. And actually one of our collaborators who speak the language has written a few op-ed pieces on it. So that can then be published. That was actually published in a local newspaper. But I think we have to think about, and this is something that Richa Nagar brings up in Muddying the Waters, that there are ways in which you can think about who you are reaching and how, and the limitations of that. So I am not so well versed in the vernacular, so I cannot do that, but we wanted to make sure that somebody else in the group could do it. So one of the challenges to then think about that, you may not be able to tick all the boxes in terms of what you might want to do, but you begin by thinking about other collaborators, people whose work you are in line with, and also think about even questions of language and translation, that even how you might design future projects. Does that help, Anne, in terms of answering your direct question?
Yeah.
But I must say, though, having said that sometimes people who I wanted to share my research with, like some of these same companies, I used to write up drafts of what I learned and sort of thought that I would, there are a couple of people who were amazingly friendly in their HR department. So I thought, oh, maybe I'll share, without naming anybody, of course, so that it doesn't threaten anyone in particular in the workplace. But when I wanted to share my research with them, I was told that they have their own research team within the company who's going to do their own analysis. A lot of the research team also often is hired from all these companies that do analysis, market analysis. So I don't know. I think it was really, really interesting to see who I can and cannot reach in that community. So another kind of person who I guess who I wanted to reach then was people who are more interested in this kind of research, right? How this might engage other scholars and other people and practitioners and policymakers who might do further research on this topic. Now, Lisa is asking a question. Thank you, Lisa. Starting out, were you able to continue the interview following this? As an interviewer, do you need to establish authority? How can you re-establish authority in a situation like this? That was a very tricky conversation. And Mr. Banerjee, as I said in the article, was a family friend, although I hadn't seen him in years. So I think there was some kind of code switching that happened during that interview where, sometimes you start to speak in the vernacular language or some ways in which you can sort of diffuse the situation so that I remember being really angry at the patronizing tone, but then kind of ignoring the questions that he was asking me by sort of switching by switching to sort of a more, how can I say, different language, and sometimes just sort of going along with it, but not answering the question he's asking me to answer. So I didn't go back to do interviews with him actually, but he introduced me to some other people, as I said in the article, who I interviewed. I wasn't able to get all my answers, which was telling itself, but I was able to interview other people. And the other thing that it was helpful in is because Mr. Banerjee was very well known in the IT circuits. Of course, this is a pseudonym, but interviewing him also opened doors for me to interview other IT executives. Does that make sense, Lisa? So I would just drop a name while trying to get interviews from another company that, I just recently spoke to this company, and then they would ask, who did you speak to? And of course, this person is kind of quite visible and often makes public statements. So it kind of allowed me to speak to sort of say that, I spoke to him. But of course, I told him that I can tell you in confidentiality, but because I'm not so sure what the IRB would think about me dropping names there, right? So there are some tricky negotiations. But would I throw out names like this for people who are workers? No, I wouldn't do that, right? These are people who are public figures, whose ideas and opinions are also out in, in the public domain. Yes, Aviv is asking a question. Yes, only few people who know who actually Mr. Banerjee is. I think I might have shared it with my aunt. It's because he is a friend of a friend. So it was tricky, but thankfully, because you change names, I use pseudonyms everywhere. I didn't share everything that happened with this person to my family, because I thought that might be too tricky, Aviv. So you're right. Sometimes I just didn't share a lot of the information, and using pseudonyms help. Yes, Danny, I get you. I'm looking at your question now. Yeah, this is okay. First, I'll answer your question about transcription. I was super brutal. I typed everything, all including the disagreements in the transcription, because I think I got into the habit of doing it, because reading in symptomatically and nuances, it takes for long time. 1 hour interview, I think took me like 5 hours to transcribe, not to not to scare anybody here. They're so valuable though. So to understand the language and also remember and write notes right after that. So one of the ways I grappled with it, Danny, is I used to have this little field notebook, like a little notebook, and I kind of vented there. I kind of vented in that notebook, talking about the emotions that came up and how I was troubled by it. In fact, I had totally forgotten about this till it came time to writing this article. I went back to my field notes, and then I found this like deluge of like things that I wrote. And I was like, oh my, that was like, then it brought back all the memories. So part of me is that I think it is really useful to have this, but also it re-triggers you a little bit, right? You remember some of these things. And I think how I dealt with it a little bit is that and also like I was probably as belligerent at some point when I got really triggered during the disagreement. So I think we were both sort of like debating back and forth. So I just think that taking a little step backwards, taking step away from it. And then I also reached out to this person again and, like wrote a follow-up email. I never heard back from them. But I think in terms of making sense of it and grappling with it, the fact that I forgot about it for a few years helped me not to have all those sort of emotions so raw, right? And the fact that I wrote about it was helpful. And then reading other people's work, it's interesting. Some of the scholars who I researched later in order to write this article, I realized that other people face this too. So that really helped in making sense of that in that moment during the interview process. I really felt bad about it after. I was like, oh gosh, I've alienated my participant, and it was terrible. I felt so bad about it. But I realized that I wasn't, this is a meant I couldn't rebuild. So I had to let that go. But also writing about it, processing it, learning a little bit about how other people do it helps you grapple with it. Are there other questions?
Well, I have a question, Sanjukta, related to that, is that, do you feel like in the interview process, it's important? I mean, I think you talk about this a little bit, but I just like to hear it again, like, it's important to, some people say doing those interviews, you should be distant, or disengaged from whatever's being said. You're supposed to be like a neutral observer or something like that. And so, like, how do you, like, what was your takeaway from that? And how would you, like, some of the people in the class are going to be doing interviews. And so, I don't know, how would you answer that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, how I take the point that some people bring up neutrality, like people bring up biases, right? Like you can talk about bias, but I see them as politics, right? That's why I talk about it in my writing, that I see as a particular kind of politics which is tied to my values as a feminist, and sometimes those are challenged. So it's not possible actually to stay neutral all the time or to distance yourself all the time, but at the same time, what I try to do in any research interview is, start with sort of more open questions, not leading questions. So for example, in some of these cases, I would say, instead of asking for, okay, does your manager abuse you, to say, okay, tell me about your life as a housekeeper in this industry. What has that been like? So, asking more broad, open-ended questions to start with. But then you need to engage, you need to build a connection. And I think when you start to do that, it's impossible to be neutral all the time. You cannot be neutral all the time. And then, in fact, taking a position or like advocating for workers who are facing difficult working conditions actually enable that collaboration, that you are a certain kind of connection that you're actually wanting to build, which is part of your project. But you may not always be speaking to people who, like when I spoke to some of the managers or the IT executives, they were like, oh, don't call us workers. We are professionals. I'm like, okay. So, questions about labor conditions, questions about working conditions, completely different. So those are the situations where I realized that this is probably not somebody I can build a connection with in that way. Right. So for some people, in some instances, those connections are, thinking about building a connection with somebody's quote unquote, difficult circumstances is fruitful and productive and possible. And in other cases, it isn't. Right. So it's just sort of like acknowledging that. Thank you, Anne. And Aviv is asking a question. How has your methodology changed, shifted over time? How has this impact for the various locations you have conducted your research in? That's a very good question. One of the things I would also say that what has impacted me is also not just the different places I have researched in, the different kinds of people I've researched or worked with, but also the role that my collaborators and co-authors have played in it, because I think that's where my interest in interdisciplinarity and questions of like language and theory come, because there's a lot that I have learned from other scholars in other fields who have similar interests but might have different way of expressing that because of the discipline that they come from. So for example, the whole language of institutional ethnography wasn't something in my repertoire, right? But I learned a lot about this idea of institutional ethnography from sociologists, from scholars who I have worked with. So it changed the way I looked at the IT firm as an institution, instead of thinking of it just as one individual company, right? Thinking of it as an institution means that it has a certain kind of ideology or rhetoric, and it helps you understand multinational technology firms as a whole sector better if you think about it from that institutional perspective. So that's something I learned from my sociologist co-authors. The other thing I learned, and this is not something I have actually been able to completely make sense of yet, and so is what is the role of a feminist scholar in these kinds of situations where you're interviewing people who, and feminists have written about this, you might go and interview people who you want to learn about their working conditions, you want to learn about one kind of oppression, but they may bring up other things that are happening in their personal lives and wanting assistance from you or wanting your intervention. And those are some things that again make me think and reflect on what is my role as a researcher or scholar. Like, where does that end and where does other kinds of alliance and collaborations begin? Because while this is a process, particularly because it's not was a process most of the time, a process that is linked to a particular kind of project and framework, oftentimes, I'll give you an example. There was one, I think she was a housekeeper, her and her partner. We interviewed both of them. This is for the newer project, the book project. And we were told, sorry, my alarm is ringing for some reason. Just ignore that if you can. I hope it's not too loud. Anyway, so this couple brought to us a challenge they were facing personally in their lives, because they were from two different castes, and they were basically facing personal challenges in their own homes or in their own families, because they eloped, and because it was an intercaste marriage. It was completely beyond the purview of the project, in terms like, what do you do as somebody who is, and who's doing a project where there are some limitations that the institutional review board places on you in terms of how much to get involved, what you can do, what you can't do. But I think that we had a very diverse team as part of this project. So we had some activist scholars who were working in the same communities as some of these people were from. So I think what we ended up doing was having more in-depth conversation with them about the process of doing collaborative research, because not everybody who was part of that research had the same views on whether we should intervene or not intervene, how we should intervene, what we should do. So I think that I learned a lot about how I would, if I did this again, I think we would need to even frame, like we would need to address this issue if we went back and did the same project again. The fact that we might be called upon to be engaged in multiple ways, and then talk within the group about what we would be comfortable doing. I don't know if that answered your question, Aviv, but these are a couple examples of what I would do differently.
So Sanjukta, do you want to answer just this last question then? Because we're
over time. I noticed that. I noticed
sorry
that.
About that.
No worries. I hope I'm not cutting into class discussion time. Let me look quickly. How did you reckon with the way you're positioning? Yes. Madison, thank you for your question. I think there are different things that happen, but one particular example that I remember is one software professional in a company told me, like almost like thought that I might be like, he really didn't want to talk to me because he thought I think I'm trying to remember what had happened that time. I think there were some news about people, like there's some kind of international sort of scandal about hackers who had hacked Microsoft or somebody's systems or procedures. But I think the blame was put on like Chinese and Indian software professionals. So when I went to interview this particular person in a company, and when they knew that I was from a US institution, he refused to speak to me. He said, you want to blame me for hacking, and you want to, like, he was very he was hostile because he thought I was going to be like, he affiliated my institutional affiliation with what was going on at that moment, and how Indian software programmers were seen. So I was very taken aback, but I learned that is real. Like, that's how he feels, and I cannot force somebody to speak to me, right? So I think as a transnational feminist, acknowledging that, that I might go with good intentions, but I have to be responsive to what my participants are actually experiencing, given the geopolitical situation at that moment, how India and Indian software programmers or Chinese programmers were being represented at that time, that probably created that scenario, right? So I think that's one example that I can think of. On the other hand, sometimes the government officials actually were very enamored by an US institutional affiliation. Why? Because at that time, the many government, state government, like regional and state governments, city governments were also competing with each other to project a better image for themselves. So they liked the institutional affiliation with the US, because US is one of the largest service providers for IT companies in India. So depending on who it is, that's my whole point about positionality of the participants, right? We just can't go with ideas that this is what I want to project, or this is the thing that matters to me because I am aware of these ideas and privileges. But on the ground, something else might come up completely that has to do with how another part of my identity or privilege or thing might come up because of that other person's positionality. Thank you all. Thank you, Madison, for your question. And thank you, everybody. I was unable to, for some reason, I don't know why I couldn't attach my presentation, but I'll send it to you, Anne, and maybe you can share it with the folks in the class if they're interested.
Thank you. Everybody can
thank you all for your questions. It was great to speak to you, and good luck with your research. And if anybody has more questions or want to chat with me outside of class, I'm happy to connect and learn more about your projects.
Okay, thank you.
Take care. Thank you so much. Bye.
Oh my gosh. That was amazing, right? That's a lot. Okay, so maybe we can just sit for a minute and take in everything that we took in. And do you want to talk a little bit in the smaller groups? Just like reflecting on what Dr. Mukherjee offered, and then after that, if you want to write, if you're up for it to write, notes, and then we'll just call it a day and meet back on Thursday. Does that sound okay? So those of you who are completely online, I'll put you in a breakout room, and then the people in the room, we can just meet here. So you can just, just respond, talk about whatever you want in relationship to Dr. Mukherjee's presentation, maybe for like, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes. And then if you have time, you could write a note, and then we'll call it a day from here. Does that sound good? Oh dear, I'm recording this.